I looked at Liam, whose arm was still around my waist, as we lay entwined on the couch, caught somewhere between comfortable and dangerously close. What happens next? I discover that there is a certain kind of quiet that permeates the house when Matthew is away, pressing some against the walls and against me to his. "Hello, everyone." The sound of the front door slamming echoed through the house, instantly catching my attention. Matthew wasn't home until the end of the week. Work has always been hard, but lately it seems like his job is all he has left behind. Business trips have become lengthy weekends, and every time he leaves, all that's left are a quick text or a weary smile from the doorway. It feels like he took a little more of my soul with him. I would wait, occupied with books, plans, or anything else to keep my mind off the silence, but nothing really filled the void left by his absence. Then there was Liam, Matthew's son, who was returning temporarily to save money while he looked for a job. I wasn't sure how to handle sharing a space with someone I hadn't spent more than a few awkward dinners with, but when he came, everything changed. Liam dropped his keys on the counter with a familiar clink hum of a song he'd half forgotten, and before I knew it, I was smiling more and lingering in the kitchen to get a little of his energy. I didn't realize how much his presence would alter the rhythm of my days. He'd sit across the table with A. I was able to talk about the things I loved and my dreams before Matthew's career took us both away. We would laugh over silly things, exchange stories, and even sit in comfortable silence. One afternoon, while I was putting groceries away, Liam drifted into the kitchen and offered to help. I watched him fold a bag, his gaze gentle and easy, and the questions he asked seemed simple enough, but they led into conversations that made me feel like I'd been sleepwalking with Liam again. I told him about my old dream of starting a small store where I would sell handmade goods in a bright, cozy place. I said, "I guess those things get left behind once real life begins." Liam nodded, but his expression was thoughtful and almost dejected. "Real life has a way of shutting those things down, doesn't it?" His words struck a chord with me that I may have forgotten or buried, but I laughed and reached for a carton of milk. About his depressing attitude toward adulthood, he laughed, but there seemed to be a shadow in his face as the days passed. Liam became a fixture in the house, and his presence was comforting. Matthew would occasionally call for a quick check-in, which made me feel as though he was doing it out of duty, but Liam was here in a way that felt genuine. One evening, he offered to make dinner as a small token of appreciation for the wonderful meals you've prepared. I smiled as I watched him move around the kitchen, putting so much care into. The silence in my life seemed to soften for a moment, and I felt important. Dinner turned into a lengthy conversation in which we discussed everything from books to places we both wanted to visit, if only life had permitted it. I'm not sure if he could tell, but that night meant more to me than I could express. It felt like I was recalling aspects of myself that I had nearly given up on discovering were still there after that night. When I walked into the living room and saw Liam reading or scrolling through his phone, I found myself looking forward to our conversations because of the warmth and humor he brought. Slowly, almost unconsciously, I began to look forward to his company in a way I hadn't anticipated. It became something I held on to like a tiny spark of light in the gray days that had become my life. However, occasionally I'd catch myself watching him for too long after I started laughing a little too loudly at one of his jokes, and in that moment a twinge of guilt stabbed through me. This was Matthew's son. After all, but then I tell myself it was nothing, just a friendship in an otherwise empty life. That's what I told myself anyway. Over the following days there were moments, small moments, really his eyes catching mine across the room, a longer than usual pause when he'd say goodnight, the way he'd ask how I was doing, as if he truly wanted to know. They were subtle, but each moment tugged at something deep inside, stirring things. As I poured coffee and looked toward the window one morning, the weight of this quiet house hit me all over again, and I felt the pain of how much I craved that feeling of closeness, of being seen for who I was. Perhaps that was all it was, just the need to feel alive again. The days passed, each one blending into the next, but in the middle of the routine, I felt that soft, almost thrilling pulse of anticipation each time. That felt equal parts thrilling and terrifying. When Liam was around, I noticed a slight quickening of my breath when he passed me in the hallway or when I heard his laughter coming from a different room. It wasn't until it was so close that I realized how much I needed that sense of warmth. One afternoon, Liam and I were in the backyard taking care of the little garden I'd neglected. His hands were covered in dirt as he worked next to me, and we talked about everything and nothing, including the books he'd. As I stood up to stretch, Liam looked up at me with a look that lingered for a moment too long, causing my cheeks to flush. I quickly looked away, embarrassed by the thrill his gaze sent through me. But then he grinned, his face as open as a child's. "You've got dirt on your cheek," he said, reaching over to brush it away. His fingers were gentle, lingering a second longer than necessary, his touch warm. I loved the music he was into in college, even his thoughts on life and ambition. I felt a gentle, unnerving thrill against my skin that left me feeling both excited and guilty. My mind was elevated as I resisted the urge to lean into his hand and feel his warmth even more, but I just laughed and dismissed it as a harmless moment. However, the days continued to pass, and with each one, I felt that there was more between us, and our conversations became more in-depth, touching on topics I hadn't discussed with anyone in years, not even Matthew and Liam. I was able to talk about my dreams, my regrets, and even Matthew called me one evening during dinner. As I talked to him on the phone, I could feel Liam's eyes on me from the other side of the table. I felt like I was divided in two, with the obedient wife on one end and a completely different woman who wanted more sitting across from him. When the call ended, I made myself smile and put the phone down with an awkward laugh. He's so busy these days that it seems like he hardly has time to breathe. I said more to myself than to Liam. He said, "You must miss him a lot," but there was something in his voice that sounded almost unbelievable. I looked at him, and as I spoke, I felt the words catch in my throat. Miss him? Do I miss him truly? The man I had married felt like a stranger, but here he was, this young man across the table, his eyes full of a warmth that I had never seen before. "Sometimes, I guess," I answered quietly, "but it's difficult to remember what it was like to be close when he's gone so frequently." Meant to share, but the words just came out before I could stop them for a second. The room went silent, and I watched Liam, waiting for him to say something, but he just nodded thoughtfully. As the days went by, I started to notice little things, like how he would stay a little longer after saying goodnight, the kind smile he would give me when he caught my eye, and the way he seemed to listen so intently as if every word I said mattered. His presence became so familiar and comforting that it was easy to fall. I brought out an old photo album of my life before Matthew, and as we went through the pages, laughing at the out-of-date hairstyles and ridiculous poses, I caught a glimpse of my younger self. A woman I'd almost forgotten. Liam laughed and pointed to a picture of me with wild hair and a bright smile. "You look so different here." I fell into his rhythm to lose myself in the ease of our companionship one rainy afternoon. The sky was dark, and thunder rumbled low in the distance. I replied, trying to laugh it off and not worry about the future, but his expression didn't change. "I don't know," he said quietly. "I think that version of you is still there sometimes when you laugh." His words lingered gently but piercingly, touching on a part of me that I tried to forget. His eyes were warmer, happier, and in some way, I felt a pang in my chest, that old familiar ache that I had buried for so long. I was younger. We sat in silence for a moment as he reached for my hand, which was warm in mine. It was such a simple gesture, but it felt like a lifeline pulling me back to myself, and I couldn't help but feel a warmth spreading through me that felt like hope. The days were passing, and what had once felt innocent between Liam and me was starting to feel like something I couldn't define or control every day. I was caught between two selves, the woman who had built a life with Matthew, and then came the night when the silence between us became oppressive. The rain had been falling in sheets all day, and by evening the thunder had subsided into a low, distant rumble. Lou and I were in the kitchen, both of us making tea, and somehow we had gotten used to this routine of cooking or cleaning up. This new self was waking up and finding unexpected joy and comfort in her stepson's presence, but I still told myself it was nothing more than friendship and an escape from my loneliness. As he poured hot water into his mug, his hand touched mine, and I felt my skin prickle and my pulse quicken. I opened my mouth to say something, but the words caught in my throat. He looked at me seriously, asking, Grace, are you okay? His voice was gentle and cautious, but there was something in his eyes that made it impossible to look away. I took a breath. Together, we moved in a rhythm that felt so natural tonight. He whispered, "You deserve to be happy." The words struck a deep chord with me, and before I could stop myself, I reached up and touched his cheek, feeling the warmth of his skin beneath. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I'm not sure I admitted it, but it's been a long time since I felt like someone actually saw me. There was a pause, a stretch of silence that felt like it might break under the weight of everything we weren't saying. I felt everything: years of loneliness, buried dreams, the weight of a life that had somehow drifted away from me. When his eyes held mine, searching, questioning, and then, as if something invisible had pulled us together, our faces inched closer, our breaths mingling in that suspended moment. The space between us vanished, and I felt his lips press softly against mine in a tentative, feather-like kiss that seemed to be testing the waters. I wasn't sure if I should pull away, but I didn't. Instead, I leaned into it, my body moving closer to his, enjoying the warmth, the thrill, the forbidden sweetness, and the sensation that time seemed to stop. I had forgotten what it was like to be touched so tenderly, to be kissed as though I were valuable, as if I mattered. As the kiss deepened, I felt his hand move to my waist, drawing me closer, and I could feel his heart racing as quickly as. He shook his head, his eyes still on mine, and his voice was barely a whisper. It felt like everything in my life had been building up to this one kiss, which broke every boundary and unwritten rule. Then, as abruptly as it had begun, I pulled reality back in with an icy jolt. I covered my mouth, my mind racing, a swirl of guilt and excitement churning inside me. I looked at him breathless, my cheeks flushed. "I am sorry," I stammered, feeling a wave of shame wash over me. The days following that kiss were a dizzying blur of guilt and longing. Liam and I hardly talked about it, but the air between us was charged electric. Every glance, every accidental touch sent a thrill through me, even as shame tugged at my heart. Hearing those words was both thrilling and heartbreaking, and it was real. It wasn't just my loneliness or some fleeting lapse of judgment. Something irreversible but always pulled back before we crossed the line again, but then everything fell apart. Matthew came back early one afternoon, days before he was supposed to, and I was upstairs cleaning the guest room when Liam was lying on the bed next to me, reading a book he had discovered on the shelf and making fun of my old literary tastes. It was all so innocent, just a little laughter, a moment that felt like old friends enjoying each other's company, but it felt close, and I was surprised by how natural it was too. As he pointed out a passage in the book and read it aloud, I lay next to him to feel his shoulder lightly brush mine. Then, we heard the front door open and close, followed by Matthew's familiar footsteps. I felt a chill go through me and tried to sit up, but for a split second, I hesitated because I didn't want to move and I didn't want to ruin this moment of comfort. However, as Matthew's footsteps approached the doorway, his face wore a mask of bewilderment and something sinister as he took in the scene. I scurried up, feeling my cheeks flush, but the silence in the room was suffocating. Matthew's gaze shifted between us, his eyes and AR growing as he took in the way we'd been lying, the closeness that must have seemed too familiar, too intimate. "What's going on here?" His voice was cold, each word deliberate. His eyes never left mine, and I could see the hurt simmering beneath his steely glare. I forced a laugh, my heart racing. "Nothing," I said too quickly. "We were just talking." Matthew's jaw clenched, his eyes shifting to Liam, who had gotten up looking like he wanted to. I wanted to say something, but I wasn't sure how. Matthew's voice was quite dangerous. "Grace, don't you think it's a little strange how much time you two spend together?" I felt the urge to defend Liam and myself rise, but shame and guilt stopped me, and I stammered over my words. "Matthew, it's not what you think we're. It's just that," he interrupted, his voice making it louder and sharper. "You don't realize how close you two have become because every time I leave, he seems to be the one who's here with you." Then Liam stepped forward, his face set, his voice firm, and Matthew looked at him, surprised, anger flaring in his eyes, and he shot back, his voice laced with bitterness. "I'm sorry, I must have forgotten that you're the one who gets it." But I felt the heat of his accusations settle over me, filling the room with a heavy, oppressive silence. Every word felt like a lash, and each one stung more than the last. He wasn't just suspicious. He was hurt, and that realization struck me more deeply than I realized. I stood frozen, torn between shock and gratitude. Liam took a breath, refusing to back down, and said, "When enough is enough in my own house." His words felt like a truth I hadn't dared to speak aloud myself, but hearing him say it brought everything into a sharp, painful clarity. This wasn't just about the time Liam and I spent together. It was about all the time I spent alone waiting for a husband who would be there for the woman. Was never really present. Matthew's face contorted, his eyes narrowing as he gazed at me as though he had never seen me before. "What is this?" he asked, his voice tight. "I've been away too much, so you decided to replace me with my own son." The accusation stung more than anything he had said before, and I opened my mouth to deny it and explain, but nothing came out. I felt as though the delicate web of lies and truths we'd been living was broken, as everything felt. Liam's fists were clenched, and his voice was shaking. "You have no idea what she's been going through, Dad. You're too busy with your work to even notice her." Matthew looked between us, his face a mix of hurt and rage. He didn't get to tell me about my own marriage, so he spat his gaze on me, filled with betrayal and what she needs. I felt the weight of his accusations settle on me, crushing me. The guilt and shame all rushed up, threatening to drown me. But underneath it was something else. "You can't just come in here and accuse me without even trying to understand that I've been here waiting, holding everything together while you're off living your life as if I barely exist." Matthew's face went cold, his eyes hardening. "So that's what this is about. You're lonely, so you turn to my son. Do you have any idea how twisted that is?" The words stung each other deeply, but they weren't completely false. I felt ashamed, exposed, and as though everything was hidden. Matthew's harsh gaze exposed a part of me in that room, but before I could say anything, Liam moved forward to stand between us. "Enough, Dad," he said quietly, his voice steady. "This isn't just about you. It's about both of you and the life you've built together or failed to build." The words hung in the air, a painful truth that neither of us wanted to face. Matthew's face was pale, his eyes narrowing as he looked at Liam, then back at me. "I need some air," he said, without saying anything else. I stood in the doorway watching as Matthew threw a bag into his car, his shoulders rigid, his face a mask of hurt and anger, the weight of what had just happened settling over me, and I could feel it in my bones, a mixture of shame, relief, and confusion twisting together in a way I couldn't fully understand. After he turned and left, leaving Liam and me alone in the silence, the weight of everything we had left unsaid pressing down on us. The house was quiet, so when Matthew left, he didn't even look back. Untangle, Liam soon found me. His face was solemn, his usual confidence had been tempered by the reality of what we'd started, and we ended up in the living room, each of us taking a corner of the couch, our eyes fixed on the floor. At first, neither of us spoke, the weight of Matthew's departure hanging thick and unyielding between us. Liam broke the silence with a steady but soft voice. "I don't want things to go this way, Grace." He looked at me, and then his eyes were filled with an emotion I couldn't place. I'm not sure what I expected to happen, but I never meant to hurt him. I nodded, barely able to look at him, my mind still racing. I know I said I didn't either, but for a long time we sat there in silence, each of us lost in our own thoughts. It felt like we were looking over the edge of a cliff, and the enormity of what lay ahead was too overwhelming to face head-on. Finally, I took a shaky breath, trying to find the right words. "Liam, I'm not sure what this is between us or how it even began, but it's changed me. Feeling invisible, buried under years of routines and silence, and somehow you made me feel alive again." He looked at me, his gaze unwavering, and I could see the depth of his own struggle written on his face. "Grace, you've given me something too. I've always felt like I was standing on the outside, never really connected to anyone, even my own father. But with you it's different. I feel understood, like I'm actually part of something real." His words stirred something deep inside me, a longing I hadn't realized was there. It was Liam's expression softened and he reached over, taking my hand in his. "I know. And I'm not saying this is simple, it's not, but I can't turn away from this grace, not now. I was longing not just for connection, but also for acceptance, for the feeling of being seen and valued in a way that went beyond titles or roles. But the reality of what we had done, what we were risking, was too great to ignore. But what does that mean for us? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. But what does that mean for us? I looked down at our hands, his fingers encircling mine in a silent pledge that I wasn't sure I could keep. I didn't know what any of this meant. It was recklessly impossible, but somehow it felt like the only thing I had left was taking a risk. I finally said it, the weight of the words weighing on us both, a risk that could destroy everything. Liam's grip tightened, his voice steadily. I know, but maybe some things are worth the risk, whose words lingered in the silence for a moment, filling it with a sense of. We could tread carefully and try to be discreet, but the path ahead was a tangled web of choices, each more delicate and precarious than the last, and as we sat there hand in hand facing the uncertain road ahead, I knew that no matter how difficult it would be, I couldn't let go yet. Quiet resolve. There was no way to undo what we felt had already been set in motion.